Hi, welcome to our presentation, Making a Difference, Language Teaching for Intercultural and International Dialogue, in which Mike and Manuela talk about their article, which is going to appear in the Foreign Language Annals 2018 in the special edition.
Hello, I'm Mike Byram. I used to work at the University of Durham in England, and now I do a little bit of teaching at the University of Luxembourg. But I started my professional life as a teacher of world languages or foreign languages when I was teaching French and German in an English secondary school.
Hi, my name is Manuela Wagner. I am Associate Professor of Foreign Language Education at the University of Connecticut. I especially enjoy collaborating with colleagues in a variety of disciplines and across educational settings to implement theory and practice, in this case, intercultural citizenship. Behind me in the picture, you can see Obi-Wan. He will appear again in the video, so watch out for him.
We want to start our presentation with the outcomes of a piece of teaching of English as a foreign language by Melina Porto, a colleague in Argentina. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a leaflet which the students had produced. It's written in Spanish, but it gives both sides of the story of the Falklands War, as it's called in England, or the Malvinas War, as it's called in Argentina, a war which took place over 30 years ago, but which the students had studied on the 30th anniversary in 2012. On the right-hand side, you can see one of the students talking with someone in the street or in a park, where she's showing him the leaflet they've produced and talking to him about what they'd been doing in the English lessons, what they'd studied, how they'd seen the two sides of the story, how they'd discovered that the media, the newspapers at the time, had been very manipulative in their presentation of the war in each country. So what she was doing was what we called action in the community. She was doing what a good active citizen does in their community, but doing it from the point of view that she'd gained from working with students in England who'd also presented the English side of the story. So there'd been a certain amount of interaction between the students, and we saw a shift in perspective by both groups, by students studying English in Argentina and by a group of students studying Spanish in England. This was a series of languages classes, but nonetheless, it was something which led to what we call action in the community, citizenships in action. There is, of course, some theory behind what Melina Porto and her students had done, some theory of intercultural language learning and some theory of intercultural citizenship education. But let's start with their starting point. Melina and her colleague Leticia in England had each a group of students learning in Argentina English and in England Spanish. And they got together over the internet. They've never met, as far as I know, face to face, and decided to work with the students on a real life problem. As I said, it was in 2012 when the 30th anniversary of the Falklands-Malvinas War raised a lot of interest again in the newspapers and so on. So the students took some time to study the events of 30 years before and present the events from the two perspectives, from the English perspective and from the Argentinian perspective, and to talk to each other across the internet, sometimes in real time, sometimes not, using whatever means they wanted, a wiki or emails, and together they produced something which was like the leaflet that we saw, but many other things as well. So there are in this activity a theory of intercultural learning, intercultural communicative competence, but putting intercultural communicative competence into a context and making it part of an active citizenship project. So the idea was that after thinking and working together on this project through the internet, as I said, the students in both countries had a new perspective on what had happened 30 years before. They'd used their languages to talk to each other, to investigate the newspapers of 30 years before, and then to put what they had learned into action by taking some kind of activity into their community. They did all kinds of things, like speaking with people in the street, as we saw, but also going into schools and talking with students about what they'd learned in their own language lessons at university. Therefore, we had national community and an international community as part of the ways in which these students were working together.
World language education is an important part of our students' education. In 2010, the then US Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, proclaimed that our students need to read, speak, and understand other languages to improve relations with other countries and to prosper economically. In order to improve relations with other countries, our students need to engage in meaningful intercultural dialogue. In the next few slides, we are going to talk about the skills, the knowledge, and the attitudes our students need to learn in order to do just that. One important part then of intercultural dialogue or intercultural communication is teaching culture when we teach language. But often culture is presented as information only, and that approach is misguided. The question now is, what culture do we teach and how do we define culture? Culture is notoriously difficult to define. There are many interesting definitions out there. We urge you to read them, to reflect on them, and to see what they mean for your teaching and for your students. Here we are going to give you a few key concepts and also some questions and some things to look out for in your teaching when you engage in the teaching of culture. So, one idea that is often used in culture definitions is that of similarities. So, certain groups behave in certain ways or have certain ways of doing things because they're motivated by beliefs and values, underlying beliefs and values. So, we don't necessarily see those, but we see the behavior. So, for language teaching, sometimes we can say culture is a set of behaviors, beliefs, and values. Something we want to avoid, however, is to teach culture as something static. Culture is dynamic. It is constantly changing. Also, culture can be of small groups or large. We want to avoid teaching culture as nation culture. Finally, language and culture are not the same. One language can represent, embody many different societies and their cultures. However, our students often see it as the same because they were socialized into culture and language at the same time. So we need to help our students understand the link between culture, language, and identity.
Well, culture is a familiar word to language teachers, and for a long time, we as language teachers have taught about foreign cultures and foreign countries, and indeed we still think that in world language education, particularly world language education which is focused upon intercultural communication, there is still an important place for knowledge about other cultures and countries, whether it's their history, their geography, and even looking at things like mathematics. But knowledge is not enough to be interculturally competent. Knowledge is not enough in intercultural communication. we also need to teach intercultural skills, because intercultural skills are just as important as knowledge in creating intercultural communicative competence in students whom we teach. In other words, as we teach languages and language skills, we need to combine them with knowledge, skills, and attitudes which are part of intercultural competence and which help our learners to become intercultural citizens. When we talk about intercultural communication and talk about intercultural communicative competence that we want our learners to have, then an important idea is that our learners should become interculturally competent speakers of a language. In other words, we're not trying to imitate native speakers, at least insofar as the cultural dimension is concerned. What we're trying to develop in our learners are the skills which help them to interact with people of another country and culture. A little like someone who is an ethnographer, who has the skills of discovering for themselves something about another country and culture, but also someone who is able to compare aspects of another culture, whether it's a small culture or a large culture, compare aspects of that other culture with their own in order to get a better understanding of both, of their own culture as well as another culture. They need to be able to analyze what they see and discover, and to evaluate their analysis, and to think about the values which underlie the items that they've evaluated, the elements of another culture that they've evaluated, the values which also underlie their own culture and that aspect of it which they're comparing with aspects of another culture. So evaluation, analysis, comparison, and discovery are all important skills which an intercultural speaker must acquire, and which are different from what the ordinary native speaker has. Our intercultural speaker is also someone who has an awareness of how languages work, an awareness of how they are interacting in a language with someone who is either writing to them or speaking to them, and vice versa, how their words and discourse are being understood by the people for whom they are writing or speaking. So in other words, they can ask themselves questions about the words that they're hearing, the discourse that they're hearing, who exactly is behind a text that they're hearing, or particularly a text that they're reading, which may look anonymous. Whose discourse is it? Whose interests are being served by this text that they're reading or hearing? And then furthermore, it's also important that they realize that some words are possible and others are impossible. In other words, in a given context, in a different or a given culture and country, it's possible to say certain things which are not possible in other countries, and certain words are just not possible in one country but are possible in another, or one culture and possible in another culture. So a speaker or a writer always is positioning him or herself as they speak and write. And an intercultural speaker is someone who is aware of that and can ask themselves questions about what's going on. How does the person who is presenting an event or some kind of phenomenon in their own culture, or indeed perhaps even in another culture, how that person frames the events, how they present the events, and how their language is used to make certain aspects of an event more evident, others perhaps are hidden. And those are the questions which a good intercultural speaker needs to ask themselves. Finally, it's important to remember that all discourse, in some sense, has been derived from what's gone before, either immediately before in the same conversation or in the same interaction through text, but also historically. There might be allusions which a good intercultural speaker can hear and see and be aware of how the speaker or writer of a text is perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously alluding to texts from the culture and country which may be quite a long way in the past. So now we can come to the implications for language teaching of what we've been saying so far. First of all, the implications for the teaching of language itself. Traditionally, teachers and learners have assumed that they should know and imitate native speakers. For example, when I was learning French at school and at university, then it was expected that I should try to produce what a native speaker could produce. And the native speaker in question was identified as the French of a good educated French speaker in France. So that whenever there were mistakes made, and we all made mistakes, then we would use reference books from France as used by French people, whether it's for checking our grammar or checking our semantics, whether it's using a particular French grammar, Grévis, as I remember, or using a French dictionary to check our semantics. But all of that has changed insofar as we now have linguae francae, notably Spanish and English, in other words, languages which are spoken by more non-native speakers than native speakers. And this fact challenges what we've taken for granted, and indeed suggests that, like native speakers, learners have their own connotations, but they're not necessarily the same as the native speaker's connotations of a word or a discourse. And the linguistic practices, therefore, are going to be influenced to some extent by the learner's own linguistic practices. And from a lingua franca perspective, this is perfectly satisfactory. We don't need, from a lingua franca perspective, to modify what we do to try to imitate a native speaker. And there are further implications for language teaching, implications of a broader perspective, perhaps one could say. For language teachers today know that students' identities are shaped by their existing languages. I speak a language and I am that language, one might say. Or indeed the other way around, the language is me. But as we learn new languages and acquire new experiences in those languages, influenced as they are by language teaching itself, then we also acquire new identities, which does not mean, of course, giving up old identities, but just adding new identities to what we have. This is something that language teachers today need to take into consideration. And then secondly, as language teachers think about the cultural dimension and the intercultural speaker that we've been talking about, the teachers need to think about how that has an impact upon understanding of other people, which is, of course, in a sense, a traditional aim of language teaching, but also very much more about understanding oneself and one's own society. It's through that emphasis upon discovering others, but also on comparing and contrasting oneself with other people, one's own culture with other cultures, whether they're small cultures or large cultures. That comparison and contrast is extremely important and leads to better understanding of oneself. And indeed, that then becomes one of the aims of language teaching, not simply that we learn about others, but that we learn about ourselves. That aim is now taken seriously and can be found in many curriculum documents and many curriculum statements, as well as indeed in some textbooks today. It's therefore an important dimension of what we've been saying so far. All of this, as a third point, is now being formulated in can-do statements from ACTFL and from the Council of Europe in the notion of intercultural competence, that one can define that notion in terms of what an interculturally competent person with the skills we've mentioned, comparing, contrasting, evaluating, discovering, someone with those skills, what they can do and what they can produce and say, and how they can act in their language, all of that can be formulated in can-do statements. And that, of course, gives us a new angle and a new lever on what we're trying to do as language teachers, because it helps us to formulate our aims and objectives in concrete terms. In our proposals that intercultural competence should become part of language teaching and its aims and objectives, we've said so far what culture consists of, what culture is. We've also thought about the ways in which interculturally competent speakers are similar but also different from, and above all different from, native speakers. So intercultural competence is summarized in this slide in a way which will help us then to move into the next stage of saying what can be done in actual teaching terms in the classroom. Intercultural competence is a matter of attitudes, of knowledge, of understanding and skills. And all of these have to be applied through activity, through action. That activity or action allows one, either together with others or indeed in some cases on one's own, to understand and respect people who are perceived to have different cultural affiliations from oneself, people who have a different culture, whether small culture or large culture. But also to be able to respond appropriately, effectively and respectfully when interacting and communicating with people who have different cultural affiliations. And that's not always easy, of course. Thirdly, an interculturally competent speaker is someone who can establish positive and constructive relationships with people from other cultures, and perhaps also go further than that and create a new activity together, work together in some direction that they've decided for themselves. Finally, they should be able to understand oneself and one's own multiple cultural affiliations. We all have many affiliations, many identities. We belong to many different cultures within what we think of as one large culture, or more accurately, one country. Within one country, we all belong to many different social groups and have many different social and cultural affiliations. And we only really become aware of those by the comparison and contrast with what looks similar but is in fact often different. And in that respect, someone who is interculturally competent is as much aware of themselves and has learnt as much about themselves as they've learnt about other people.
So now you will ask, how do I start? What does this look like? How can I integrate intercultural communicative competence in my teaching? Well, there are a number of models that are designed for a variety of purposes. So first you need to know what you want to achieve, and then you can choose the model that you would like to use. For our purpose here, on the right-hand side, you see a book, Teaching Intercultural Competence Across the Age Range, From Theory to Practice. The title says it all. This is a book that was edited by Mike, Dory, Perugini, and myself. What we did here is we used Mike's model of intercultural communicative competence and applied it to a variety of different settings, units from third grade up to higher education. And the main question was, how can we integrate intercultural communicative competence in a meaningful way in our language teaching? teachers and graduate students worked together. They modified the unit, they implemented it, and then they wrote about their experience and their implementation. So as you can see, there are now more and more resources available that really talk about the application. Also the one you saw at the very beginning that Mike told you about, that Melina and Leticia did, an international project. The projects described in this book that you see on the right-hand side here are in a local context in a school in Connecticut. Another place to look for this theory having been implemented in practice is the book on the right-hand side here, From Principles to Practice in Education for Intercultural Citizenship. Intercultural citizenship, as a reminder, is intercultural competence plus action in the here and now, doing something in the here and now with the skills you acquired. So what we did in this project is a number of international collaborators took curriculum, we brought content-based instruction, or as it's also called, content and language integrated learning, into the world language classroom. We gave the students often challenging content, problems that they had to solve, questions that they were answering together, hoping that they would learn the language, doing that, which worked. And those projects often also led to action in the community. And that's exactly what we wanted. It was the action component of the intercultural citizenship. And at the same time, we looked at how their level of criticality developed. And this book was edited by Michael Byram, Irina Golubeva, Han Hui, and myself.
So now we think of the ways forward, the next steps. And here we see Obi making some next steps for us through the snow.